Most of you don't likely know who Chris Licht is, and there's really no reason for you to have known. He was brought in roughly a year ago as the chief executive of CNN after his predecessor, Jeff Zucker, suffered all kinds of ethical scandals, including claims that he was involved in a consensual adult relationship with another CNN executive, that he was helping Chris Cuomo combat allegations against that CNN host, that he too had been engaged in improper conduct in helping his brother, the governor of New York, fend off assault allegations, and all sorts of other problems at the network, including the fact that nobody was watching the network. It was simply a collapsing disaster. And Chris Licht was brought in, and one of the things that he immediately did and tried to implement was the idea that one of the reasons CNN is falling and failing is because nobody trusts it any longer. And the reason nobody trusts it any longer is because it is openly and blatantly little more than a messaging machine for the Democratic Party. And anybody who wants that already has MSNBC to give it to them, and there's no reason anybody would go to CNN in order to get it. They became addicted to the ratings high, which was nothing more than a sugar high that they got that was actually ushered in by Donald Trump. And by talking about Trump 24 hours a day, they staved off collapse. But with Trump gone, there was simply no reason for anybody else to tune into CNN any longer, and their ratings continued to collapse under Licht. And what makes this story interesting is not the fact that now they're going to bring somebody else to oversee CNN's inevitable and well-deserved collapse. What's interesting is the reaction among most of the corporate media, both inside CNN and out, who are celebrating Licht's demise solely because he wanted to transform that network away from being shills to the Democratic Party and into the independent news network that it once was. That really reveals how the corporate media sees itself in general. And the fact that they wanted his head on a pike and now have it and now are celebrating, even while they know that it hardly matters who supervises or runs CNN, that cable news is dying along with much of the corporate media, that's the really revealing part. So let's look first at what the story is from the New York Times today. There you see it on the screen. It says, quote, Chris Licht, the former television producer who oversaw a brief and chaotic run as chairman of CNN, is out at the network. There's the article, the headline: Chris Licht is out at CNN, leaving network at a crossroads. Mr. Licht's turbulent time running the 24-hour news organization lasted slightly more than a year. And there's that first paragraph that we just read to you. It goes on, quote, David Zaslav, the chief executive of CNN's parent, Warner Brothers Discovery, informed staff on Wednesday morning that he had met with Mr. Licht and that he was leaving effective immediately. Mr. Licht's 13-month run at CNN was marked by one controversy after another. He got off to a bumpy start even before he had officially started when he oversaw the shuttering of the costly CNN Plus streaming service at the request of its network's new owners, who were skeptical about a standalone digital product. Let's take a moment to remember that, because it was one of the funniest things to ever happen in media. Prior to Chris Licht's arrival, CNN and their bosses, including Jeff Zucker, had decided that one way to save CNN was to create a streaming service that you had to pay for. And on the streaming service, they were going to offer the same host who you could already watch for free, but like everybody else in the country, were choosing not to because you had no interest in what they were saying. So they were essentially saying, here are all these people who, if you want, you can watch for free, and you're choosing not to. Nobody watches them. And so our genius idea is we're now going to make you pay to watch them, so that we can generate profit for ourselves, and you will pay to watch the people you've already made clear you have no interest in. It lasted a grand total of 21 days. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, on marketing, on publicity, on trumpeting the arrival of this exciting streaming service. And then Chris Licht was brought in, and they ordered him to kill it. After 21 days, it was dead. And as the New York Times says, the cuts resulted in scores of layoffs, for which he was blamed. It goes on, quote, ratings plummeted during Mr. Licht's management and a series of programming miscues, including an ill-fated morning show co-anchored by Don Lemon, as well as organizing a town hall featuring former President Donald J. Trump that was subject to withering criticisms, did little to shore up support with his colleagues. Now, I think this is the really important part. The straw that broke the camel's back for Chris Licht was his decision to take the presidential candidate who is leading in all the polls, not only to become the Republican nominee, but to be the next president. He's leading virtually all polls against Joe Biden if he were to get the nomination, and leading all polls by 20 or 30 points over his the next leading candidate, Ron DeSantis. So, needless to say, by definition, Donald Trump has a very good chance to become the next president. He also happened to be the president just 2 years ago, and yet the idea that CNN should interview him, should allow him to go on their airwaves and let the American people hear what he has to say in response to questions being asked of him by a reporter who was told to and is fully capable of responding to whatever he says, fact-checking him if she thinks it's merited, as she did. This idea was so controversial inside CNN. In fact, it was worse than controversial. It provoked large amounts of indignation among CNN staffers, to the point that people like Anderson Cooper and Christiane Amanpour went on the air and criticized CNN for the crime of interviewing Donald Trump. This is how institutionally rotted that network is. They really do believe that their only mission is to promote the Democratic Party, or at the very least do everything possible to sabotage Donald Trump and his movement. They are overtly an activist organization. And that activism is all about promoting the Democratic Party and ensuring the Trump movement never obtains power again, even if the American people decide to vote for Donald Trump. And so putting him on the air, and that town hall that they had with him was by far their biggest rating night in a long, long time. It got over 3 million viewers, which is in a different universe for what CNN ever gets. They just had a similar town hall with Nikki Haley, who's another GOP presidential candidate, with Jake Tapper, and they got a grand total of 550,000 people watching. Only 100 or 150,000 people in the so-called demo, the only thing that matters really, the age group that advertisers care about, which is 25 to 54. They could barely get 500,000 people to watch a town hall with Nikki Haley. So the only time anyone watched CNN still is when they got Donald Trump to come on their network, and yet because so ingrained in the culture and the ethos of American corporate media is the idea that their singular mission is to ensure the victory and success of the Democratic Party, they were outraged. CNN journalists were, openly, about Chris Licht's decision to allow Donald Trump to vandalize their airwaves. That is how far gone the corporate media is in the United States. And it's not just CNN journalists who thought that way. Most of the corporate media did. The Atlantic published, as the New York Times says here, quote, "Things deteriorated last week when the Atlantic published a 15,000-word profile extensively documenting Mr. Licht's stormy tenure, including criticism of the network's pandemic coverage that rankled the network's rank and file." The entire media was out to get Chris Licht for no reason other than the fact that he wanted to prevent CNN from continuing to act as a servant to the Democratic Party. Not for ideological reasons, but just because CNN was failing and collapsing by trying to be that. Nobody was watching. The New York Times article goes on, quote, "Further worsening matters was CNN's financial performance. The network generated $750 million in profit last year, including one-time losses from the CNN Plus streaming service, down from $1.25 billion the year before." Now, you may wonder how CNN makes that much profit when nobody watches, and the answer is twofold. One is they still do attract a lot of attention to things like their website. But the bigger reason is because CNN is on every cable network and it's on every cable package. And cable companies pay CNN to include their network in their cable package because they assume, even though it seems to be quite untrue, that people who pay for cable want CNN. They never watch it. But that's where CNN's profit comes from. That cable companies pay them to include for the right to include them in the cable package, even though nobody watches them. The article goes on, quote, Mr. Licht's abrupt departure, earlier reported by Puck, represents the latest hit in a tumultuous era for the network. In December 2021, the primetime anchor Chris Cuomo was fired amid an ethics scandal involving his brother, the former Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York. 2 months later, the network's longtime chief executive, Jeff Zucker, was let go for failing to disclose a relationship with a colleague, the senior executive Allison Gollust. He was likewise pushed out within weeks of Mr. Zucker's departure. It did not help matters for Mr. Licht that Mr. Zucker enjoyed wide loyalty from top anchors as well as rank-and-file workers, even after his exit. Once employees began souring on Mr. Licht, Mr. Zucker turned into a quasi-grievance switchboard for frustrated staff members. One of Mr. Licht's first big programming moves was to reassign Mr. Lemon from his primetime perch to a new morning show. Mr. Licht said the show, which Mr. Lemon would anchor with Poppy Harlow and Caitlin Collins, would, quote, set the tone for the news organization. Instead, CNN This Morning, which debuted in November, was marred by low ratings and tensions on and off the set. 2 months after Mr. Lemon said that a woman over the age of 50 was not, quote, in her prime, he was fired, effectively blowing up the show that had been Mr. Licht's signature project. That was not the only misstep. Mr. Licht took his time. Warner Brothers Discovery executives believed far too much time to figure out a primetime lineup as it was rapidly losing viewers. To the shock of many CNN staff members, the network began last month to occasionally lose to Newsmax in total viewers in prime time. And the Trump town hall, which aired on May 10th, was excoriated both outside and within CNN. In other words, that was really the last straw. The fact that he dared put a Republican, and not just any Republican, but Donald Trump, on CNN's airwaves. They simply do not believe that media outlets any longer should report on people who disagree with Democratic Party ideology or who in any way are have any relationship to Donald Trump or to his campaign. Now, a serious historical revision is going on in the way that only our media can do. What they're trying to say is that this is proof that any attempt to liberate media outlets from Democratic Party servitude or to suggest that the media outlets have a responsibility to do something other than just advance American liberalism is likely to fail. In other words, they're trying to say CNN was this model of great success until Chris Licht came in and caused it all to fail. Here, for example, is a tweet today from a former Washington Post journalist, and then he went to The Atlantic, Wesley Lowery. And there you see on the screen, quote, Chris Licht, the latest in a line of media leaders who burn their own house down with their determination to be anti-woke and prove their, quote, independence from liberals who criticize them on Twitter. So that's the narrative that they're trying to create, that CNN failed under Chris Licht because he had the audacity to say that news outlets should be independent and that they should be immune from the demands of liberals on Twitter that they only adhere to liberal ideology. That is as explicit as it gets about what their views are on what media outlets should do. Now, the reality is this is all a fairy tale. Long before Chris Licht came in to run CNN, CNN's ratings were already in total decline, in free fall, precisely because nobody trusted them, precisely because everybody knew they were a propaganda arm of the Democratic Party. Here from Forbes in February of 2022, so just days before Chris Licht was hired and Jeff Zucker was fired, there you see the headlines, quote, CNN's ratings collapse, primetime down nearly 70% in the key demo, 70%. CNN's ratings were described as in collapse before Chris Licht came on board, and in great part that was due to the fact that CNN lost all the trust it had built up over several decades by turning itself into a pro-Democratic Party anti-Trump outlet during the Trump years. Here too from the Daily Beast in December of 2021, so a couple of months after, or before rather, Jeff Zucker was fired and Chris Licht was brought in. Quote, CNN bottomed out in 2021. Will viewers come back? The network reigned supreme at the end of the Trump era, but has fallen back to earth. What happened? So that, I think, is the most important thing to note here, is that the reason these media outlets are collapsing is because people no longer trust them. And how you rebuild trust, there's only one way to do that, And that is to prove that you are not captive to either one of these parties, but instead are independent and willing to report things honestly. A major reason, according to Chris Licht, that CNN had lost faith among the public, that nobody trusted them any longer, was because of their constantly hysterical COVID coverage. You probably remember when Donald Trump was president, they constantly had a clock or a chart counting in this gruesome, dreary way the number of people who died of COVID, as though each one of those corpses was the direct fault of Donald Trump. And then suddenly when Joe Biden came in, CNN totally lost interest in how many people were dying of COVID, even though more people died of COVID under Donald Trump, under Joe Biden than under Donald Trump. Despite the fact that Trump ushered in the vaccine that CNN told everybody to take. And obviously, when you do things like that, when you so blatantly exploit a pandemic for purely partisan and political ends, of course, the public will lose trust in you. Hear from the new media outlet Semaphore that reports a lot on media. Its editor-in-chief is Ben Smith, who was the longtime media columnist for the New York Times. This is by Max Tanney on June 2023. There you see the headline, CNN lost trust over COVID coverage. Internal report found. Quote, The Atlantic's Friday profile of the embattled CEO Chris Licht drew cringes at Hudson Yard, that's the CNN headquarters, but also anger over Licht's criticism of the network's award-winning pandemic coverage. Quote, in the beginning, it was a trusted source. This crazy thing, no one understands it. Help us make sense of it. What's going on, Licht said. And I think then it got to a place where, oh, wow, we got to keep getting those ratings. We got to keep getting the sense of urgency. People walked outside and they go, this is not my life. This is not my reality. You guys are just saying this because you need the ratings. You need the clicks. I don't trust you, he said. The network won multiple prizes for its coverage of COVID-19, including the Annenberg's Public Policy Center's Cronkite-Jackson Prize. Oh, it has Cronkite in there and the Annenberg Public Policy Center. It must be incredibly prestigious. And it was awarded to Dr. Sanjay Gupta for his coverage, quote, correcting COVID-19 misinformation. But Licht's criticism was drawn from CNN's own research. Last year, CNN commissioned a survey examining viewer trust and the places where CNN was succeeding and falling short with viewers across the ideological spectrum. According to a partial copy of the report, which hasn't been revealed before, CNN's coverage of COVID-19 was the third leading cause of distrust in the network, behind liberal bias. That was the first cause of distrust, liberal bias, and then the Chris Cuomo situation. Survey respondents of all ideological stripes criticized the network's, quote, overly dramatic and sensational and, quote, dire reporting, the report said. So this is the reality, that the reason trust and faith in media outlets and corporate media outlets are in free fall at exactly the time people are turning to independent media more and more, as we're about to show you with the next segment, regarding Tucker Carlson's return of his show to Twitter, is precisely because people understand that in the Trump years, these media outlets devoted themselves to the destruction of one party and the advancement of another. They also got extremely irresponsible with hysterical and false reporting on things like Russiagate and COVID. They are widely perceived to have a liberal bias, and therefore nobody trusts them any longer. And so with the exception of a couple media giants, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, pretty much every sector of media is failing. Fox News is now failing because it got rid of Tucker Carlson. And their ratings have been in decline ever since because people understand that if you're a news network that fires your most popular host because he won't promote your ideology, you're not really a news network, you're an ideological activist outlet, and people no longer trust those. And that's why increasingly people are turning more and more to independent media. And the fact that the corporate media, almost all of them, reacted with such anger toward Chris Licht's attempt to make CNN just a little bit more independent and to say that it should no longer be this outlet of partisan captivity to the Democratic Party shows you that the corporate media believes, even if it means they're going to fail, that their overarching mission is to advance the Democratic Party and ensure the defeat of the Republican Party. People already see this. Polls overwhelmingly show that they see it. And the reason we decided to cover this somewhat amusing episode is not because it matters who steers the ships of any of these declining organizations. It doesn't. But because the reaction of the rest of the media is so revealing about how they see their own function. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.